Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox and welcome back to Versus. This is a rematch. After the 2018 launch of the Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter, I compared it to the then current Rolex Submariner, and the Omega came out ahead. Today, we're comparing the 2018 to present Diver 300 meter to the new Rolex Submariner, the 126610LN, 41 millimeters versus 42, very similar watches. This is apples to apples, and Versus starts now. Zooming out a little bit, let's take a look at the new kid in town. Not really, because every Rolex is always an evolution of the previous model, but for the Submariner, quite a bit has changed. Some of these changes are aesthetic, some are mechanical, but we're going to put this watch through its paces and get a sense of how it wears. Now, the timepiece, of course, is 41 millimeters in diameter, though I struggle to find any one dimension, and I've used calipers, but I struggle to find any one dimension that's more than 0.7 millimeters larger than before. So it wears the same, and it mostly looks the same. In terms of thickness, it's 12.4 millimeters. Lug-to-lug, it's 48.1 millimeters, and then end-link to end-link, it is 51.3 millimeters with a 21 millimeter spacing between the lugs. The end-link of the bracelet's now a little bit broader. The lugs are a little bit narrower, so they don't appear quite as squared off. They have more of a taper at their ends. So there's some changes there. They don't necessarily affect how the watch wears. Pop open the clasp, throw it on the wrist. My wrist is 16 centimeters in circumference, and you get a good sense of how the watch fits. It is low enough to fit underneath the cuff, and of that there is no doubt. You can see down the barrel, I've got plenty of clearance on each side of my wrist, so I think down to about 14 centimeters circumference, you're going to wear this watch just fine. Over the top, you can see the lugs aren't really at the edge of my wrist. I've got some clearance here. I've got some room to wear this on a smaller wrist. It's nicely counterweighted by the clasp and the bracelet. It feels balanced and solid. Taking a look at the bracelet, you know it well. It is the Rolex Oyster, 3 links here on the Submariner, satin tops, polished sides, and then removable links fixed by screws. It has been mooted by some that the new Submariner bracelet doesn't feel quite as solid or expensive or maybe silky as the previous model. Now, I don't know if that's just early production, people completely misjudging something that's more matter of feel than objective measurement, but it does seem as though the bracelet feels a little bit different than in the past. And I'm not sure if that's less solidity, but I do interpret it as inferiority to the feel of the Omega bracelet. So by comparison, the Omega is actually coming out ahead here for bracelet feel. This is a Rolex Oyster clasp, polished internally, and you can see a combination of polish and satin finish externally. Now, there are 2 locking mechanisms. One, there's a beacon to hook. There's this lift lock system. Let me get the stupid sticker out of the way. There's this lift lock system that will latch shut, and you can see it snap shut. So you can't actually pull it open even with the clamshell open. That's actually a second lock. So you've got that system for latching it shut, and it is sure tight. Now, taking a look internally, you can see Rolex will give you 1/2 link. The rest of the links are full-sized, and then the glide lock system. So you've got 20 millimeters of adjustability in 2 millimeter increments. This is great if you just want to fine-tune the sizing, or if you want to pull it out all the way for use over some sort of a diving suit. Again, the lug taper is a little bit more elegant now. The lugs are less broad at their ends, though the super case is still the super case. It's squared off at its end and it's sheer on its side. The bevels are long gone, consigned to Rolex history, and the case itself is fairly imposing. It does look like a 41, but then again, the previous watch looked bigger than its 40 millimeters, so not much changes aesthetically. You have a trip-lock crown, screw down, 300 meters water resistant, a crown that is remarkably solid, and I would say when the crowns are withdrawn, the crown of the Rolex feels more solid in the hand. The bezel, 120 click, is very smooth. It features a ceramic insert, and each of these little indices is a well with a platinum infill, so the material inside of the bezel will not oxidize or tarnish over time. Rolex goes the extra mile, so the bezel pearl here is sapphire capped. The dial includes a lacquered base and white gold hands, as well as indices with Rolex chromalite blue lume. Of course, you know, post-2018, each new Rolex model to come out has featured the little crown between Swiss and Made. That's your overt cue that this is not the previous Submariner. And then in the case, a new 70-hour power reserve movement. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we compare. So the watch itself has changed in subtle ways. The big changes, of course, small change in size, a small change in the aesthetics of the lug, and a small change on the dial, but you do go from 48 hours of power reserve up to 70, so that's a big change. Let's talk about the Omega. The Omega is the same as the last time we saw it. We should compare pricing here. I think it's important to note pricing. This is a watch that costs $9,150 new. Used, it goes for about $14,950 full box and papers. And the Omega costs about $5,200 on the full bracelet, as you see it here. Used, it's going to be about $4,550. So 42 millimeters in diameter by 13.9 millimeters thick, and lug-to-lug, it's 50 millimeters with a 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs. Throw it on the wrist. It does look like, well, it looks like the thicker profile it is. It'll still fit underneath most sleeves, but you can see across the wrist, the watch does have more prominent lugs. It does feel like it's pushing out closer to the edge of your wrist, even though with the end links, the Rolex is actually a little bit broader across the wrist. This watch has that 50 millimeter lug-to-lug span, whereas the actual lugs of the Rolex are 48.1 across the wrist. I would recommend these watches for wrists of the same size, 14 centimeters circumference as a sort of minimum. You can see it's flat enough to fit underneath the cuff, as it's almost slipping underneath the cuff that I'm wearing. Now, taking a look at the bracelet, I'll give you this. The Omega bracelet does appear more like a dress bracelet with those polished intermediates and those narrow center links, but I'll also say that it feels more solid than the Rolex, and in the hand, it's quite apparent. You can also see internally there are half links built into the bracelet for fine sizing, and as with Rolex, we have removable links fixed by screws. We also have two different ways to size this thing. So you've got a push-button slider that's incremental with 9.6 millimeters of total adjustment, and then you've got the Diver 300 meters long-standing fold-out. You do wind up with more total adjustability here, but it's not a total linear adjustment because one is an all or nothing, and then one is a slider, but it should be pleasing to most, especially with the half links built into both sides of the bracelet. You will find the right size here. Now, different from the pre-2018 watch, you can see there are no solid end links here. The end links are pivoted, which means though this watch is broader across the wrist, it wears the same way. The bracelet pulls straight down from the lug. The bezel is 120 click like the Rolex. Let's have a listen. 120 click like the Rolex, but not exactly like the Rolex. The feel, though precise, is a bit more coarse and mechanical. So keep that in mind. I do think the Rolex has the advantage in terms of bezel feel. Now, the bezel insert here is also black ceramic. Rather than a platinum infill, we have cold enamel. The dial is actually made of ceramic, and you can see zirconium oxide, the chemical formula, just below the so-called James Bond style skeleton hands. Because the dial is made of ceramic, it's going to be more tarnish resistant and scratch resistant over time than the Rolex's lacquer. So while here we have rhodium plated steel indices and hands, we have a much more durable dial base. And after 2018, the lovable Omega wave motif came back after a hiatus from 2012 to 2017. Here the waves are actually cut by laser. Now, of course, this watch during the 90s, or at least its predecessor style, launched in 1993, was seen on the wrist of Pierce Brosnan during his turn as Bond. So both of these watches have a James Bond heritage. Right up through Timothy Dalton in the 80s, you would have seen Rolex. And from Pierce Brosnan to the present, Omega's been on the wrist, though Brosnan tended to wear the Diver 300 meter, and Daniel Craig has more often than not worn the Planet Ocean. But this specific design has been known as the Bond-style Seamaster, and probably because of that, this is the oldest surviving Seamaster design dating back to 1993. It is also the longest-running single Seamaster design, as for the most part, the watch has been continuously redesigned since the first Seamaster 300 debuted back in 1957. It's been redesigned frequently, so this is the most enduring look among Seamasters. Now, a big difference here, there is a display case back and a 55-hour power reserve, as well as a coaxial escapement and a silicone hairspring. 300 meters water resistant, the same as the Rolex, but you do have this Helium escape valve. You probably don't need it, but then again, if you want it on a Rolex, you have to pay an upcharge for a Sea Dweller. So it's nice to see it included for $5,200 new on the Omega. You may not be a saturation diver, but it's a wonderful conversation piece, and luxury often is about getting more than you need. So let's talk about these watches and talk about advantages. First with Rolex. Okay, status, stature, and this is a mainstream article of pop culture. Even my mom, before I was in the watch industry, knew all about the Rolex Submariner, or at least what it looked like. My grandma, who is emphatically not into watches and was born in the era of the pocket watch, she would still know the name Rolex. So this is the only watch brand that transcends the watch culture, the watch social media ecosystem. It's an article of mainstream luxury. It has a brand name comparable in equity to the likes of Mercedes-Benz, Coca-Cola, and Apple. It's in that league. So if you want something to be recognized, it's gonna be this. Let's talk about the better price and new I would not say it's necessarily the more accessible watch used, but if you buy this watch for $9,150, you're probably going to sell it for at least $5,000 more than you paid, assuming you don't brutalize the watch. Whereas with the Omega, even though $4,550 is good resale for a $5,200 watch, you're still losing a little bit. Whereas the Rolex, your money's probably safe forever, and if you want to wear it for a year and then sell it for profit, you could easily do so. Also, let's talk about the Rolex in terms of power reserve. 70 hours here. This is the single mainspring barrel Omega coaxial design, so it's not the 60-hour power reserve, it's the 55. So there is a difference between 55 and 70. That's no small difference. In terms of the heritage here, now I mentioned this watch is part of a design series that came out in 1993, and the Seamaster as a dive watch has been around since 1957, but really, back in 1953, the two pioneers of the space, the modern dive watch, it was the Rolex Submariner or the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, and this watch has always looked like the Submariner. The first Submariner owner would recognize this watch. Him in his 6204, he'd recognize this as a Submariner. And in 100 years, this will still be recognizable as a Submariner. Whereas I don't think a 1957 Diver 300 owner would have recognized his Seamaster as related to this one right here. I think you cover up the label, he would not have known that was an Omega Seamaster. So in terms of real heritage and design continuity, advantage Rolex. Also, I'm going to talk about the bezel feel. It's better. It's a combination of a crisp detent and a silky glide, and the Omega can't match it for feel or for sound. I'll also mention that the clasp here seems like a better overall solution, as it is double locking. With the lift lock system and the clamshell, it's probably more secure than the single trigger lock of the Omega. And also with 20 millimeters of incremental adjustment, we do have the entire adjustable range here incrementally sizable, whereas with the Omega, it's one part flip out, one part increment. I like having the full range adjustable in increments. I'll also mention here that in terms of precision, Omega makes no specific promises about the accuracy of these watches, other than to say they will meet the COSC, which is over 24 hours, -4 + 6 seconds, whereas Rolex meets the COSC, gets the certificate, and then cases up the movement and guarantees it will run better than -2 + 2 seconds per day. That is very impressive. Now let's talk about the ways they're the same. I think in terms of lume, they're equal. In terms of warranty, they're both 5 years. In terms of James Bond, they've both had exposure. And in terms of water resistance, they're both 300 meters. But let's talk about some of the advantages that the Omega brings to the table. There's no brand baggage here. Now, I've had people comment on my Omega Seamaster in the past, but in general, they're people who kind of know watches or want to learn more about luxury watches. They're not necessarily casing me to rob me or trying to size up my wealth by my watch. That's not really a problem you have when you wear the Omega Seamaster. Strangers aren't going to run up, push their finger into your chest and ask, is that a real XYZ? They won't do that. With Rolex, they will. So you get some anonymity when you wear your luxury with this watch. A display case back. Admirable. I like to see that for which I paid. It's not a hand-finished movement, but it is an attractive-looking movement. You can see the arabesque Côte de Genève and the black polished screws, and I like them both. You can also see here with a full balance bridge, it's got the same free-sprung index and full balance bridge shock resistance as the Rolex, though with less power reserve. What it does have is greater anti-magnetic resilience thanks to the silicone hairspring. And the silicone hairspring makes this watch effectively immune even to MRIs, which is genuinely impressive. I'll also mention that the helium escape valve is an advantage you get here that you don't get with the Rolex. Quel dommage, I know. But at the end of the day, I'm going to give credit to Omega for including it because it does cost some money to engineer and then machine. So you get more features here. I'll also mention that the coax, it's more interesting to me because even though the Rolex Chronergy escapement, which is Liga-formed, is just as sophisticated and functionally identical. The coax, which achieves the same accuracy goals as well as extended power reserve goals, was conceived by George Daniels. You'll never know the name of the person who engineered or styled your Rolex, whereas with this watch you do know the name George Daniels and that your Omega has a small piece of the George Daniels legacy inside it, and that's very, very cool. I'm also going to say that the bracelet feel here is superior. It's smoother to fold and articulate. It seems heavier. There seems to be less play in it. I'm genuinely shocked that I made that call, but in the hand, it does feel more impressive than the Rolex. And that's saying something considering Omega used to be far behind Rolex in bracelet construction and bracelet feel. So Omega is catching up fast in that regard. Which of these two watches do I want? Honestly, I like them both, but with the thinner profile, and I do mean quite a bit thinner, 12.4 versus 13.9, the Rolex just looks more elegant on the wrist, and with the 70-hour power reserve, the superior chronometric performance guaranteed from the factory, the heritage that does date back longer, and a design that hasn't been reshuffled every couple of decades, I think the small changes made for 2020 allow me to call this in the Rolex's favor. So guys, let me know, which of these watches, price no object, which of these watches would you rather put on your wrist? Tell me in the description below. Back with Rolex and Omega, you can see the Omega actually uses green lume for the bezel pearl and the minute hand to make it easier to judge one against the other in the dark. The Rolex, of course, uses chromolite blue lume. Omega has its own version of that, but I would say they're about equal in legibility, so no winner to choose here.